Hello, everyone, and welcome to FIT Authors Talk. My name is Brian Fallon, and I'm the Interim Director of Faculty Development and the Center for Excellence in Teaching. I want to begin by thanking Greta Ernest and the Gladys Marcus Library for inviting me to guest host the Authors Series, showcasing some of FIT's newest faculty members. I also want to thank Jen Brady for her work to coordinate this event. Today's author is Dr. Subh Gooptu. Dr. Gooptu is an assistant professor of world literature in FIT's English and Communication Studies Department in the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. She completed her PhD in English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and specializes in post-colonial and Anglophone literatures with a focus on South Asia and the Caribbean, Asian diasporic studies, and histories of labor migration in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Her work under discussion today, Watery Archives, Transoceanic Narratives in Andil, Gosine's Our Holy Waters and Mine, appears in the Feminist Review. Dr. Gooptu has prepared a presentation for her talk today. If you have any questions, I invite you to put them in the chat, and I will be happy to ask them for you at the end of the talk. Now, please help me welcome Dr. Gooptu for her FIT Author Talks debut. Take it away, Sue.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm going to begin by sharing my slides. Can you see this, Brian? Because you're the only person I can. Okay, great. Thank you. I want to echo some of the things that Brian just said. Thank you first and foremost to Jen for facilitating all of this. It's taken a few days of preparation to get here with all the technology. And thank you to Greta for inviting me to do this. And Brian, thank you to you for facilitating the event and giving me advice when I wanted it about how to do this. And I'm also really looking forward to the talks that follow in this series as well. I'm really looking forward to the ones that are coming up after mine. And I think this is an excellent opportunity for me, being new to FIT, to not just share my work, but also learn about other people's work and what they're doing. So I just wanted to say that. Today's talk, I'm going to be talking about my work and showing some images so that hopefully you'll be able to follow what I'm saying and won't get too bored because you'll see some images. But as Brian said, feel free to ask any questions if you have any. And if I stand up and it looks weird, it's because I'm trying to get the light in my office to stay on, like right now, because it's motion sensor triggered, basically. So with that, I want to say that it's such a thrill to share my work at FIT because I really think it's an audience that is invested in thinking about the connections between artistic practices, writing, and critical thinking. I want to begin by thanking all of you here who are here present as audience members, listening, giving me your evening for a little bit of time. I know how tiring it is to be in the middle of the semester, so I really appreciate it. And I also want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. The Lenape are a diasporic people that remain closely connected with this land, that is New York, and are its rightful stewards. My work engages in organized and erratic processes of decolonization. So without this acknowledgement, my work would not be anywhere near complete. So I wanted to begin with that. So making history from archives is a problem that plagues many communities across the world, even ones here in the US. The article I will be introducing today was born out of my interest in noting how fictional and artistic renderings of what we don't know or what we might not know challenges official histories. I wrote Watery Archives, Transoceanic Narratives in Andil, Gosine's Our Holy Waters and Mine for the journal Feminist Review in a special issue titled Oceans. The special issue was interested in scholarship that approached encounters in and around oceans and other water bodies, that challenged what we already knew about those encounters. In my own doctoral research, I had already been examining archival materials, fiction, nonfiction texts about women from British India who were shipped to work on plantations in other British colonies, starting in the 18th century, after the abolition of the slave trade and the emancipation of enslaved peoples. My dissertation specifically focused on the particular system of indentured labor that was contracted, documented, and archived extensively to prove its legality or justify its distinction from slavery. Some women were shipped as married partners of working men, and many others were single, widowed, or outcast women who either ran away from home or escaped their families or their husbands and were contracted to work on plantations. I want to note that at this point, it was illegal for women in British India to leave their homes for work without the permission of their father or their husband at this point in time. Most of these women could not write and were from poor and rural families, and many were allegedly captured or kidnapped by recruiters and officials of the British government. And their resistances or agency that they may have had was almost never recognized or recorded. I focus on women who were shipped to British Guyana, to Trinidad and Jamaica specifically, because those were part of British Caribbean, and settled on land bordering the plantations that they worked on thereafter. So ones who stayed behind and didn't return to their homes. I was most interested in thinking about how language around these women workers or laborers shaped how we have remembered them today, whether by institutions or governments or in private settings within families and their descendants. I asked whether they were remembered at all, by whom, how they were remembered, and how they will continue to be remembered. Andil Gosine is an artist and a scholar who traces his family back to this specific history. In my dissertation, I engaged with Gosine's scholarship, especially thinking about the politics of representative practices and the conversation about what counts as representation. And I've been having this conversation in my classes a lot recently. But I realized that this engagement in my dissertation did not do justice to the contribution that Gosine makes as an interdisciplinary thinker. The article recognizes how Gosine's artistic practice is as much scholarly as his scholarly practice is artistic. I also had the good fortune of having many conversations with him about how his work influenced my own research. And I was very, very grateful that he so willingly gave me his blessing for this article. So I just want to acknowledge the sort of two-way engagement where he was as interested in hearing my thoughts as, and I obviously was very, very excited to hear what he had to say. So when I began researching this specific history of labor, I turned to archival materials to examine their language around indentured women, or coolie women as they are also known, and one specifically indentured in plantations in the Caribbean. Whether it was in national archives in England and India, or digital archives of Guyana, or even in the US, a few patterns emerged. First, indentureship or indentured labor was considered to be one of the first forms of labor as a category following the abolition of slavery. And so there was extensive recording, documentation from the perspective of officials, travelers, legal clerks, etc. Second, in these documents, there was a constant tension of proving that this was different from enslavement. And even though the workers who signed or thumbprinted the contracts could not read the contracts that they were agreeing to. Third, in some moments, indentured men who were shipped on these ships as well appeared to have voices when they were promoted from being laborers to managers or disciplinarians. And then finally, indentured women or coolie women were almost exclusively appearing in very fleeting glimpses. Their descriptions were heard during scandals, acts of disciplining, causing trouble of some kind, or as objectified sources of both beauty and grotesqueness. But almost no representation of their own voices, perspectives were present. And if they were almost always mediated by someone or something else. One such example is from the slide that you see in front of you, is from the text, which is a travelogue called Down in the Carib, written by William Patton, who was a New York-based traveler who went to the Caribbean and wrote hundreds of pages on what he saw there. And he has a whole section where he's describing a coolie woman who's pictured here. And he says that there are two reasons why he is so invested in recording everything he saw about the coolie woman, was because he wanted an artist to portray the woman for his audience. And so his descriptions are almost clinical in how detailed they are. So I just wanted to say that. So he described this coolie woman that he saw as a kind of ornament, and this is his word. One who, according to him, is both grotesque and outlandish in appearance. In that moment specifically, he's both enthralled and repulsed in some ways by this person, this woman who is walking past him. And I wanted to focus on the sort of effect that has on us as readers. These observations that I was making about what I noticed in the archives are in line with scholarship of other historians and some literature scholars, such as Radhika Mongia, Gayatri Bahadur, Madhavi Gill, Lisa Lowe, and many others who use words such as tainted, incomplete, and violent to describe colonial archives of British India, as well as the British Caribbean, actually. Gayatri Bahadur specifically is someone who I extensively engage with in my own writing, describes these patterns by using this phrase that I think is very powerful. And she says that there was a structural stealing of voices, not that these voices were absent or that these voices were unable to say things, but there was a stealing of these voices. She notes that in many ways, these patterns echoed and reflected the observations of scholarship of the African diaspora as well. In my own work, I refer to Black studies scholars such as Saidia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, and Wendy Walters, and note how seemingly disparate histories, so the Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean feels very far away from each other, but there are so many ways in which they intersect, and this is one major way in which they do. And so it was very important for me to not just think of the research I was doing in its own silo, but also notice how some of these patterns extended to other places. I'm happy to speak more about this connection, obviously, and to people who are interested in thinking about, say, the power or the problems or potentials of historical documents or archives, especially in the context of labor. And I have a bunch of names that I can give you if anyone's interested. So Andil Gosine, as I said before, is a visual artist and professor of environmental arts, social justice, and Caribbean studies at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. His scholarship and artwork explores how to bring together histories of marginalized communities and histories of the environment. In 2014, Gosine first performed in Our Holy Waters and Mine as a performance mosaic of oral, so both hearing and speaking, visual and textual interventions to represent an afterlife of indentureship. He was born in Trinidad in the Caribbean, and his artistic and academic corpus explores his repeated and recursive journeys from the Caribbean to North America to Europe for himself personally and his family's journeys within South Asia and other parts of the world as well. His work utilizes the slippages of mixed method and multimedia as a ruse to almost trick the audience into thinking more deeply about them looking at his art. in Our Holy Waters and Mine, the one that I'm going to focus on, he uses objects that are very familiar and bearing some cultural significance, only to challenge the accepted narratives around them and the history of those objects. This performance became the first exhibit to be included in the visual public archive that he curates, called After Indenture. Again, happy to share that as well. And the materials he uses in his artwork are very cognizant of the environmental impact of art, and particularly given that his artwork is thinking of decolonization, he's also invested in caring for nature and natural objects in his work. He also performed this piece in 2018 in Miami as part of another group of performances as well. His most recent work explores the idea of wild natures in relation to Caribbean queerness and practices of visual art and environmental justice. So this idea of objects and nature and how they interact is very crucial to Professor Gosine. So in my article, I put forth my concept of watery archives. When I wrote this, I was very hesitant about whether this would make sense to anyone else. But since then, I have heard from some other people who said that actually it does make some sense. So I feel a little more confident in that. But I use the concept of watery archives to describe Gosine's scholarly and artistic practices. I examine the representation of water and waterways in Our Holy Waters and Mine to illustrate how Gosine's relations with water provides a heuristic and a representative practice for critiquing colonialism and indentureship. Why watery archives, you might ask? It's because it emphasizes a few different characteristics. One, it offers me a critical lens to suggest a possibility of a history being both transparent and slightly warped when we look at it. Second, it recognizes that encounters and relations with water, whether it being as an act of journeying through water or worshiping water in some way, among many other things, are in fact material relations. Third, it departs from conventions of history that is solely based in the idea of countries and nations, and thinks about things beyond just land-based ideas of belonging and citizenship. And finally, there is little fixity, even when there is stillness or boundaries when it comes to bodies of water. We associate the ideas of fluidity and always being in flow. And that, for me, sort of reflects back on the concept as a kind of archive that is always in process. So therefore, Gosine builds his watery archives in relation to multiple disparate modes of artistic, scholarly, and political expressions. And he speaks directly to and along with other Indo-Caribbean artists, scholars, in an attempt to explore histories that are now submerged within much more dominating narratives of national history, sexuality, racial and ethnic separation, and most importantly, helps him sort of focus on the silence of certain communities and how that's translated to an absence of their experience when it is not the case at all. And I'm going to talk more about the concept of watery archive, and especially interested if anyone in the audience can think of other interpretations they might have of the term watery archives. We'd love to hear about that. So before I jump into the concept a little bit more, I want to share and describe and summarize what the performance actually was, because I think it'll give everyone a good sense of what it's trying to do. So water is at the heart of Gosine's whole work and archive. Oceanic exchanges, whether it's connections or losses or discoveries or tragedies, define Gosine's personal and political connection to indentureship. So Our Holy Waters and Mine maps the present as being shaped by the past, but not limited by it. His installation, and you're seeing an image from it right now, opens with the chant, "Our holy waters are not the Ganges," repeated 108 times, referencing a very popular and still very much practiced Hindu ritual worship, interspersed with the names of 12 waterways. These waterways include 6 bodies of water crossed during the journey of indenture. So they include the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the Caribbean Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the Berbice River, and the Gulf of Paria, as well as 6 waterways that shaped Gosine's own personal life. So those include La Seine, the Thames, Rio Manzanares, Lake Ontario, Potomac River, and Hudson River. The chanting of these waterways is looped, and it ends with Lauren O'Grady's voice, forming a chorus at the end. Lauren O'Grady is a concept artist and cultural critic based in New York, who has influenced Gosine's work extensively, especially because she works on her identity as a Black racialized subject and being queer and thinking through multiple mediums. So these 3 distinct layers of an audio track almost function like an incantation that surrounds the whole performance. And this chant travels across different distances and oceans and seas and rivers to connect generational journeys as well as individual ones. Evoking these 12 waterways and 12 and then 6 more, Gosine is simultaneously rejecting the Ganges River in South Asia as the holy waters, and sort of talking to that tension, and I'm happy to go into that a little bit more. And he then invites the other person you see in this image, Sir Rodney, to enter stage dressed in white in a very sort of bare stage and take part in this almost ritualistic performance. In a reading after a performance of this piece in 2018, Gosine echoes that he's using a different concept here, the concept of coolitude, the idea of thinking of all people who have had some connection to water bodies to have some contact with one another. In this performance, all the journeys are mediated through representations of water and waterways. As the chants of the waterways continues, Gosine enters the stage dressed in white and unfurls a cotton bindle, and he lays out 12 empty jars, as you can see here, each etched with 12 names from the vocal track, and underneath the word Kalapani appears on these glass jars. Kalapani, the words translate to meaning dark or black waters, and is associated with both darkness and loss. That was a part of ship travel in the 18th and 19th century, and is mostly thought of as a way to lose your caste, community, and kinship. This question of caste is actually a very important one in this context, and I'm happy to speak more about this because many of these indentured workers was said to have lost their caste and were rejected by their families, but they reconstituted ways of following caste in the Caribbean as well, which almost changed the shape of the Caribbean as well. With Sir Rodney, an artist also based in New York, Gosine pours water into each of these jars and then places white flowers into 2 jars, La Seine and Hudson River. At the end of the performance, Gosine reads from a note where he explains that the jars remind him of his own grandfather's jar of holy water from the river Ganges that he used in worship or offerings during worship. However, for Gosine, his holy water takes on a different meaning. He writes, "Our holy waters are the dark waters of the Kalapani, not the one of the Ganges." The act of pouring water into jars animates these everyday objects, and the chant, "Our holy waters are not the Ganges," plays on loop to sort of emphasize this idea of it coming to life. In turn, the water also becomes holy in its ability to animate. The cotton bindle, the glass jars filled with water are reminiscent of other images I've seen in archives depicting people who were coming as indentured workers who only carried one sort of cotton pouch with them that they carried across these oceans that they were crossing. These objects are transformed in this performance and no longer are conveyors of any kind of cultural connection or authenticity. And using these identical glass jars, Gosine dislocates historical narratives that prevent one singular origin for his story. They no longer signify a connection to his geographical or biological roots in colonial India, and instead help him focus on his connection to waters. He creates his own framework to think of some of his own work and his methodology and describes it as wrecking work, where he talks about the importance for him to transform everyday objects into archival artifacts. Through his aesthetic practice, Gosine transforms these objects, which would otherwise be cultural signifiers or conveyors of Indianness, and instead negotiates their presence in the afterlife of indentureship. In many other projects, he has used cutlass, which is a tool that is used for both agricultural purposes and is also notoriously historically known for being the object of domestic violence against women, as well as other kinds of food objects that he then sort of imbues with aesthetic beauty and shows how violence and beauty can exist together. In our holy waters and mine, the etched glass jars hold kala pani, unlike his own grandfather's holy water. And instead of propping up any narratives of cultural authenticity, these objects disguise and highlight the legacies of historical and material conditions that characterize his transoceanic crossings. So to sort of bring these things together, Our Holy Waters and Mine as a performance is interested in being both transoceanic, covering so many different waterways, as well as transhistorical, bringing together his grandfather's experience as well as Gosine's own experience. His performance is traversing vast geographies as well as different temporalities. He's traveling within personal journeys and exploring his own personal journeys as well as historical journeys that have shaped his art without necessarily being limited or circumscribed by it. The act of pouring itself, pouring of water, becomes his way of a symbolic navigation. So the water is no longer denoting a holiness or an origin, and instead it is both water that is worth worshiping as well as one that is causing him to be outcast. So water becomes both a symbolic and aesthetic signifier. And he uses this to maneuver his individual and collective relation with his own history. So as the title of the installation suggests, he navigates relations through water to understand both a collective R and an individual mine to sort of reckon with his own past. In conceiving the content, so I'm going to jump back and talk a little bit just about my conception, because I think that'll sort of tie in. That was a summary of the performance, and now I want to bring it back to my concept. So in conceiving the concept of watery archives, two major methodologies emerge. One, the act, the metaphor, and lens of submergence, literally drowning something in water or putting it underwater, or putting it next to water or with water, is a practice. And the second methodology, which is to recognize water as a spectacle in itself. Gosine's work in this way, through this performance, also speaks to the field of oceanic humanities in many ways. This particular field explores how literary, artistic, and cultural expressions decenter the importance of land and border-based territoriality, and engages with bodies of water being important sites of belonging and producing histories of identities and politics. One other scholar who I look at pretty closely in this article is Melody Ju, who has a book called Wild Blue Media, where she uses her work underwater. She literally dives underwater and thinks about artwork that is preserved and created underneath water, and thinks of submergence as a practice of reading and interpretation. So in my concept, however, submergence is an act of seeing differently or dislodging predetermined narratives of history, politics, and community. This practice preserves the shape of the original object, so not warping the original object, but it offers new modes of viewing and interpreting and understanding that is cognizant of the fluidity of the water in which it is submerged. Obviously, within Gosine's own sort of practice, his representation of water animating material objects also takes on the second methodology, where he uses water as a kind of spectacle. Spectacle is very crucial to this history because in the archives, many marginalized identities were only present in moments of grand spectacle or gross spectacle or scandal. So this conflict between lack of visibility and hyper visibility is a pretty major pattern. So this conception of water as spectacle does a few things. First, it prioritizes the relationship between material and aesthetic practices of narrating history, that there is not just material and not just aesthetic, but both of them together. Second, thinking of water as spectacle includes connotations of fluidity and tidal patterns to narratives of history instead of a linear one. Third, it decenters a search for geographic or spatial origins or roots. Fourth, it emphasizes the circularity of ideas, objects, knowledge. And finally, like I said before, it displaces the hypervisibility of violated or marginalized bodies. To this end, water sort of engages with this history of indentured labor in two significant ways in Gosine's performance. First, it takes on the burden of representation. So Gosine is not representing someone else's body that is either violated or invisible or hypervisible. And second, it offers the context and metaphors of being watery or transparent or tidal in some kind of way, and allows me to bring that into my own sort of archival research. So not just focusing on sort of the binary between violence and loss and the sad, unfortunate absence or silent figures, these are moved out of focus, and instead water becomes the spectacle, and its inherent malleability and slipperiness and its constantly being unreachable and unconfinable sort of becomes its main feature. So that sort of brings me to the central end of the central ideas of this article. And I want to spend the last few minutes here talking a little bit about how I take this concept and I apply it to Gosine's other work, as well as just thinking about it more broadly in terms of how I can allow this concept to grow as we move forward. Beyond the scope of my article, the concept of watery archives can be examined in relation to Gosine's other work, as well as artwork of other artists who share Gosine's own interests. In many of those instances, even if the material object being used in aesthetic practice is not water, the methodological, theoretical, and analytical practices of the concept can be explored. For instance, Gosine has a series of photographs called Cane Portraiture, and I'll come back to this. And in this particular series, he imagines these colonial era postcards that you see on the slide in front of you. And these postcards were produced in huge quantities to attract tourists from New York and London to visit and explore Caribbean islands. You can see from these examples that the women who are in these postcards look striking in some, look away, look bemused in others. but they're striking in different ways. Many of them are wearing jewelry, interesting fabrics. But all of these postcards in some way seem to be suggesting that they are part of the Caribbean landscape or hospitality that tourists might encounter when they arrive. So Gosine reimagines the perspective of these postcards and sort of reimagines what the postcards, the kind of violence these postcards might have done. And he invites descendants of coolie women to dress as they please and stand however they wish in the back of in front of a background of sugarcane, which was one of the most one of the biggest industries that indentured workers participated in. His insistence on the diversity of these descendants in terms of race, gender, sexuality. He invites artists, authors, scholars, people who are visiting his exhibition to showcase what he considers an antidote to the wounding of the narratives, skewed narratives that came out of these postcards here. This particular piece ties my concept of watery archives to Gosine's own theorization of wrecking work, which brings together disparate objects. Following, this is another set of images from those postcards. These two people specifically, the one on the left, she is a very, very well-known author named Shani Mudu, and this on the right is Richard Fung, who is a really important Caribbean filmmaker. And so he's very invested in thinking about everyone's artistic practices. Following in this vein, recently Gosine curated an exhibition. When I say recent, I mean end of last year, 2022. He curated an exhibition of various descendants and invited them. He curated an exhibition where he invited various descendants of indenture to contribute to a special show. And I wanted to show some images from it here. It was, as you can tell, called Everything Slackens in a Wreck. And this blue object here is Gosine's own work. And then he invited artists such as Carrie Sinapa Mary, who is a descendant of indentured workers in Guadeloupe, which I don't really look at in my dissertation, but I think is important here, who created the image on the left with the woman on the chair. And then on the right, you have Andrea Chung, who uses sugarcane, sugar, different kinds of cotton sort of materials to bring together all the influences that the history of indenture sort of has on these artists. In introducing these at the end of my talk, I'm interested in noting how the theorization of watery archives thrives on bringing together artwork, photography, performance, literature's potentials and limitations in addressing issues of history writing. In my dissertation, I engage with all of these forms in different ways. And so some chapters focus more so on literature and history. Other chapters sort of focus on archives and literature. So it's a combination of all of these things coming together and thinking about how we remember these histories. This kind of collective work perhaps moves us closer to reorganizing what has been missed or recognizing what has been missed, silenced, or ignored. So I want to wrap up by saying that in my concept of watery archives, or the one that I'm presenting in this article, I'm not focusing on a specific medium or a single narrative or ideology. And instead, I'm very invested in thinking about the concept as one that is based within what is fluid and what is always in process. And I wanted to end with this particular slide here with a bunch of people's works that I engage with in my dissertation as well as beyond. And also for those who are interested in knowing more and seeing some exhibitions that engage with these questions. So for example, artists Suchitra Matai and Renduka Maharaj have recently had very excellent exhibitions in New York. So I would recommend seeing that if their name comes up at any point. And then I always get questions about, do you have any recommendations for books that I can read? So I wanted to put names of some authors in there as well. And so with that, I will wrap up my attempt to sort of summarize my work in this particular article. And I will say thank you to the library once again for inviting me, and to Brian and Jen. And I'm excited to hear what you all have to say. If you can come up, if you have specific approaches to this concept, I would love to hear them. Brian, if you want to come in.
Thank you, Sue. That was wonderful. I have some questions for you that I thought about earlier today, and actually, early on in your discussion on your talk, you were talking about having discussions in class about what counts as representation. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how your research is informing your teaching at FIT and the kinds of conversations that you're able to have in your class.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that I'm teaching a class called Intro to Asian American Literature and History. And in that one, we talk a lot about like the politics of representation. And in my research, the politics of representation comes in, especially when I'm thinking about how do you represent the voices of people who are not speaking or who have not spoken or ones who are silent. So in what ways is it violent to represent their voices, and in what ways do we desperately need to represent their voices? And this is always where I am thinking about. And then my students really have been thinking a lot about representation, what counts as good representation and what counts as bad representation, or what counts as not black and white but gray representation when it comes to what they see in media and popular culture today, for instance. So we've been thinking a lot about how in many attempts in our current moment to address exclusions, we end up falling into a trap where we sort of perpetuate many stereotypes and perpetuate many issues that other people have pointed out. And there is some harm that we don't recognize when we think that any representation is good. So we're asking, I've had students, and I haven't even had to necessarily ask them this question. They've asked each other, is that, yeah, but it's fine if we have this many actors from this community, but what does it mean if it's the same kind of movies being made, if it's the same kind of stories being told? And I'm really excited to see how even just introducing some of these things leads students to ask those questions of how do we recognize representation not as a blanket good thing, but how can we be critical of representation itself?
Have you posed the issue of stolen voices to your students?
Yes, definitely, because we talk a lot about appropriation in those classes, especially because it's an Asian diaspora class. We talk a lot about their experiences and what they have seen in terms of what they think counts as appropriation and what doesn't. And so when we talk about appropriation, when we talk about who is silenced, we talk a lot about how it's not that those voices are necessarily absent or they cannot speak for themselves. It's an act of stealing. It's an act of theft of some kind, because there is a possibility of profit that comes out of it. And I think that's the important part here. And it goes back to Bahadur's point about structural stealing. There's a lot that the officials got out of not giving voice to the indentured women, right? Like they got a lot in terms of actual monetary financial profit. And they also got a lot in terms of being accountable to other institutions where they could justify that, look, it's not as bad as slavery, which is in itself a drastically problematic stance to have when you have to justify that. But it's a question of when there is stealing involved, what is gotten out of that stealing that I think is important to talk about. That's a great question, by the way.
Thank you. If anybody else wants to pose a question in the chat, please do. I guess I can ask another question. I'm just curious to think about these types of issues and how they have an impact on our everyday lives. So what do you think are some main takeaways from your research that play out in our day-to-day that we should be thinking about from your point of view?
Yeah, I think I can think about this question in two ways. I think for me, as somebody who's doing research, it's very important for me to constantly be thinking about all the different things that make up a certain narrative. So on one hand, when I'm doing research, I'm very invested in seeing what has already been acknowledged as part of serious research and what is sort of pushed aside as, oh, this is not important. So being from an English department, the kinds of literature that I focused on is not usually considered good enough literature, right? And so just noticing those kind of politics that are at play for me as a researcher is very important. And it's also important for me to notice how when I'm writing about histories, that there isn't just one form or mode of expression. There's literature, but there's also art, and then there's there's oral work that I don't really go into, but I mention it every now and then in my dissertation. So that I think it affects my everyday life as a researcher in that kind of way. And I think at FIT, I definitely see how it affects the everyday life of my students. Because I think many of our students think of themselves as artists and creators in some form or the other, and they are invested they show to me that they're invested, and I think they are deeply invested in making sure that they are not sort of repeating violences that they have seen happen over time. And that kind of acknowledgement or awareness of how a lot of what I talk about through my research actually does apply to their work as well, and that they want to do, because they recognize that they're going to go into industries. And so how do they keep thinking critically as they go into their individual industries? I think that's how it really, I hope that for them is the way that it applies to their everyday life.
There's a question in the chat from Zeta. It says, you were asking of other ways to interpret water, I think. And I was thinking of water in economic terms, profit, political waters. Do any of these conceptions of water come about in the text that you work on?
Yeah, I love that question. What an incredible question. It does not come out in this article. Obviously, this article is published and done. I do notice in the article that Gosine himself is very invested in thinking about the environmental impacts and things like that, and also about social justice and environment intersecting with one another. But I do think as I take this concept forward, I definitely see a way in which the kinds of terms that you're talking about, by thinking about profit and like political waters, will become a pretty major part of that. Even within the history that I'm talking about, there is so much that material there is about what water belongs to whom and who has right over certain kinds of water, and how water was used to profit the plantation in that history. So I'm going to take your question and run with it as I keep thinking. Thank you. Do you want to add anything to that? I was wondering if you had any sort of thoughts moving from there. Oh, I don't think you can. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Yeah. But thank you. That was a really good question. And it is one that I have been thinking about a lot. And I think for a long while in many of these histories, water was the site of huge loss, death, tragedy, etc. And I think Gosine in this particular performance is interested in thinking about water not just as loss, but as a site of creation. But I also see the importance of including things like profit, violence, politics within the waters. Yeah, great question. I think there's another one.
Yes, there's another question from Matthew. It says, I look at water as something that can dilute the observations of cultures. Are waters too cloudy?
I'm not sure what, I would love to hear a little bit more about what you mean by dilute the observations of cultures. I think in this particular performance, Gosine is specifically invested in reimagining how in his family's religious practices, water has such a holy role, and it played such an important part of worship. And that is what connected him to his sense of cultural identity. But that is not enough for him, because if he only focused on a cultural identity that is so far away from him, then it led him to constantly spiral about, but I'm not really that, but I'm not really this. And so in this performance, he's interested in thinking about not water as something that is just holy, but as also something that is dark and yeah, full of violence in some ways. Yes, and I do think so. I think it's a really good idea. I think if I take this forward, I will add those as considerations as well. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? I'll give you a minute to type away if you have anything that you'd like to contribute. Well, in that case, Sub, do you have any final words for us?
No, I want to say thank you to everyone who who attended this. I know it's been a long day for most of you, so I really, really appreciate it. And thank you again to Jen and Greta and Brian, to you for helping me along the way while doing this. I'm really excited, and I hope that I get to come back and talk about, it's often in academia, I think it's really often, especially in my field, to talk about research when it's in process or when it's being done. And then once it's published, we forget about it, or we tend to forget about it. So it's really nice to come back. I almost read my own article as I was reading, as if I was reading someone else's, and I could like deconstruct it. So it was a really nice opportunity to do that. So thank you so much to everyone, and thank you for inviting me to do this.
Thank you for sharing your work with us today. And thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to the Gladys Marcus Library for putting on this series. I hope you all have a good evening.